Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be starting in just a moment. We're glad you're with us.
Hello, everyone out in Boulder and beyond. Welcome to our webinar today. We are Boulder Psychological Services. I am Jenny Key. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in Boulder, specializing in adolescents and children and anxiety. So I'm here today with my co-presenter, Harmony Barrett Isaacs, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Jenny. Yes, I'm Harmony Barrett Isaacs. I am a licensed professional counselor, also here in Boulder, and I work with teens and young adults and families and specialize in anxiety and depression, transitional issues. So I'm excited to be here today to talk about anxiety, and obviously it's a big issue, so there's a lot to talk about.
It is, absolutely. And this time of year, I feel like especially is hard for parents and for their kiddos. So hopefully we can give you a little bit of insight today. We would love to hear your thoughts and questions, so feel free to ask away as we're presenting. And when we can, we will address your concerns. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about how to recognize the symptoms of anxiety at different age levels, because sometimes things can come out that look a little different than anxiety as we experience it or notice it in others as adults. So with our younger children, under the ages of 5, we tend to see some different behavior changes. And of course, when you're talking about an infant, you might see something different than you would your 5-year-old, but some of the common things that you can look for are if you're hearing reports from other care professionals that your child is fighting or seems to be acting out with the other children that they hang out with, then that's a good indicator there's some anxiety going on. Avoiding, and the opposite of avoiding would be clinging to you. If you feel like your younger child is all of a sudden, if they tend to be more independent and now they seem to need you more, they're a little bit more fussy. Their mood can change by just exhibiting more crying, being less motivated, seeming just down and not quite themselves, and also maybe a little bit fearful. And then if their routine changes not out of the blue, but if you notice even over time that there are some sleep disturbances where they seem to be sleeping okay before, if they are kind of fussy about what they're eating or not wanting to eat, then those might be some indicators that there is anxiety going on. So we will go into more of what anxiety is about and what you can do about it. But initially, those are some things that I want you to keep in mind with your children that are under the age of 5. Children that are older, so now we're talking about elementary school kids and up through early middle school, you start to see the behavior becomes a little bit more complex. You might experience a little bit of lying. Your child might be isolating more. They seem like they may be shutting down. Again, fighting, not quite cooperating with you, with siblings, with peers. And stealing, that's one that a lot of people don't realize can be connected to anxiety. There can be a real fear, and sometimes stealing is a way of letting you know what's happening, but also it's a way of gaining security. I heard one time that one of my first graders was stealing a lot of pencils from his classmates. He didn't need pencils, but he had a lot of anxiety about some situations that were going on at home, and that was our indicator. And along with that, their mood can look differently. Even if they don't seem afraid, they don't seem nervous, they may just have mood swings. And if that's not typical, that might be something to pay attention to and observe. perseverating. That's a word that we tend to use when a child has a repeated thought, kind of like an obsessive thought that they have trouble letting go of. They're perseverating about a classroom assignment or about a certain classmate or peer. And they may seem despondent, maybe a little bit checked out, and that may be a good cover-up. Kids are very masterful at not being congruent with what they're feeling on the inside and what their emotions look like on the outside. And again, be mindful of their routine. If their participation in school changes, their relationship with their friends and how they want to spend time with their friends versus how they want to spend time with you. And bedtime tends to be a big one when there's anxiety. It's hard to get them up sometimes, and it's hard to put them to bed. So I kind of lumped this next age group into a big category, but I just really want to emphasize that as teenagers, just for the sake of time, I will collectively talk about this, but keep in mind that your middle schooler has much different developmental needs and things going on than your high school or even early high school versus late high school. So transition times are a time to really watch out for anxiety and things that they may be nervous about that even as an adult and as their parent, you may not understand is a big deal for them, like how will they dress for school. And so some of that they might let you know through their behaviors by, again, lying. That tends to be a common one that kids have trouble explaining. I quite often hear parents say, well, why would you say that? You know it's not true. And the truth is they don't know why. So lying, it may be a cover-up for a deeper fear that's going on. Stealing. Unfortunately, as kiddos get older, one of the things that we tend to see now a lot, Harmony and I both in our practice, is cutting as a way of letting us know that they're feeling some anxiety or fears. So that doesn't necessarily mean they're suicidal, but they may be harming themselves because they feel a lack of control in their environment. And that's one thing that they can do to feel control, an unhealthy thing, but still worth mentioning that may be a sign that your child has anxiety.
And can be a way to self-regulate those kind of the activation of the feeling. So
yeah, absolutely, because they get the release when they cut, and it's a form of coping and soothing that isn't always effective or that works. And acting out of any kind, yelling, cussing at, when they start to get a little older. I mean, always watch out for this in younger kiddos too, but when they start to get a little older, possible drug use. A lot of kids use drugs because of peer pressure and that anxiety, but also to self-medicate. And again, we talked about this with the cutting, but self-soothing, avoiding school, avoiding all kinds of different activities, friends, things like that.
And I would add to that all of those things may show up and that your teenager can't necessarily identify that they're doing those things because they have anxiety. But when you're kind of pull it apart and able to assess what's going on underneath those behaviors, then you realize that there is anxiety. I have a lot of teenagers who don't even realize that they're anxious, and then they realize that they're self-medicating with marijuana, which we see a lot here in Boulder.
Yes, absolutely. That's such an important point. And also to remind you, just as parents too, part of your job and part of what we do in our sessions with teenagers is to help teach just how to identify their emotions and articulate. So what may look like rage or anger, underneath it might be a fear. So these are just some of the things that you can keep in mind and thinking about when working with your child and a professional. So again, their routines might change. You may notice that they're staying with teenagers. We tend to see them staying up very late, watching a lot of Netflix, can't live without their phones. They almost get addicted to their phones, lateness to things, not really caring if they're late. So those are all warning signs that there may be a deeper anxiety happening for your child. Okay.
I like this picture. Bring a little humor to it. So this is Harmony, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what anxiety is, somewhat from a biological standpoint. And I'm going to start with just a general overview of what anxiety is. So Anxiety is a normal reaction to stress or new situations. As humans, we all experience kind of an activation in our system, almost like riding. We're feeling that a little bit right now. We're riding a roller coaster, and it's the build up as you approach the top, and then there's the release as you come down the other side. And that this is a very normal reaction to stress and new situations. And anxiety, it signals the body to take action. I'll cover positive stress and versus negative stress in just a minute. But in general, our biological reactions to stress, which we can experience as anxiety, is our body's call to action. Worrying is a form of protection. We're biologically built to scan the environment for threats and then to mobilize if necessary in order to survive. That's why it's built into our systems, into our nervous systems. But because we have so little actual threat to our survival in modern day, our nervous systems are kind of going a little haywire sometimes in response to perceived threats and perceived, I guess, the stress that comes into our system on a everyday basis. No one size fits all in terms of solutions. So no one strategy works for everyone. This is just like anything else. So think about what coping skills work for you as a parent, and it's a good place to start in terms of helping your child to figure out what may work for them. But be flexible and creative, because the opposite may be true too. What works for you in terms of helping to cope and manage your own stress may not work for your child at all. So that's where flexibility and creativity comes in.
And I'd like to add too, I hear a lot from the parents that I work with that they bring their children for some support is, this kid really, they say this to me, and I love that parents can be this honest. That's super important. Be honest with yourself and whoever is supporting you. But, people say this kid to me doesn't have a reason to be stressed. And so when Harmony was talking about, the stimuli that's coming in and your brain's job is to interpret whether or not is a threat, our kids are born very sensitive, very wise creatures. Social media, they are learning a lot more. They're a lot more connected to each other. So what is perceived as a threat to your child? I just want to emphasize that it may not seem to you like it should be a threat. And we'll talk about this later, how to not minimize that for your child in order to help alleviate it quicker and to understand it better so that it doesn't become more of a chronic problem.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. And that chronic stress or anxiety can cause the nervous system to seek out stimulation rather than relaxation. So a state of calm can almost feel boring. And when Jenny was talking about adolescents being on Netflix and on their phones, that's often keeping the nervous system activated, because that feels more normal than to be at a calm state. And it can be almost like an addiction in some way to being stimulated and overstimulated. So one example I have is a client who spends a lot of time thinking about what she has to do and keeping all of her ducks in a row. This is really important to her. And even though she wants to relax, she has this kind of message in her brain that she feels lazy when she's not stressed out or she's not keeping tabs on everything. And so it's really hard then for her to find a level of relaxation because she feels lazy doing it. And this happens for a lot of people, the kind of the thought process that then is connected in with the biological process. So I like to go over this with my clients, with teenagers, with younger kids too, and for us in general, to understand that stress isn't all bad, that it is something that actually serves us and helps us. And so understanding, instead of experiencing all stress as this ball of overwhelm, that there's a point to where stress serves us, and that's called eustress or positive stress. It helps prepare us for challenges like taking a test or avoiding a car accident. That's what it says on here. And it's what motivates us. And it's really important to start to identify with your kids, how does stress help them? Where do they like the feeling of being kind of charged up? And maybe before a big sporting event, it helps them to do their best. Where it becomes a problem is when it's on the side of distress or negative stress, which is more ongoing and chronic. And that's where it can lead to more of the negative behaviors like substance abuse, anxiety, depression, the system shuts down, sleep problems, emotional exhaustion, and overall weakening of the immune system, which is a big kind of side effect of chronic stress or anxiety. So helping to understand that some things are helpful in terms of stress, and some things take a real toll on our psyche and our emotions and our body.
That reminds me that a lot of children that have anxiety have frequent visits to the doctors, frequent colds, frequent stomach problems, frequent headaches, that all seem to have difficulty. You have difficulty identifying, and that may be something that indicates anxiety is happening on a deeper level also.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the brain in the best way that I can. And I'm going to do this in a pretty basic way. I'm not going to go really in depth into the whole process of the brain, but I'm going to give kind of a basic overview of what's happening at that level. In terms of what's activated in anxiety, there are two parts of the brain. One is the reptilian brain, which is our basic survival functions that activate fight, flight, or freeze, and it's the survival part of our brain, obviously, and that the nervous system is activated when this part of the brain is activated, and all those physical symptoms that I'll talk about in just a moment too. And even if they seem irrational, the person who is experiencing the symptoms, the kind of the nervous system activation, they can't tell what's rational and irrational when they're in that part of their brain. So what you're trying to do is access then the prefrontal cortex, which is the center for logical, rational thought, emotion regulation, and it controls impulses. So in order to do that, you can't just say, well, let's think logically about that when someone is in a very activated state in terms of their nervous system. It doesn't work. You've probably tried it. It doesn't, you've maybe done it with yourself, and it doesn't actually do anything. So you want to validate and reassure that they're safe and try to bring them back to that thinking brain. So,
which can take a long time.
It can.
It can take hours or sometimes days. And if you think about it, this part of our brain was really given to us to keep us alive. It caused us to run from a bear. So if you think a bear is chasing you, you don't want anyone to try to stop and talk to you about what you're feeling and what the bear is like and why the bear is chasing you.
You want to escape the bear.
You want to escape the bear, and then you want to calm down from just escaping the bear. So just think about it like that. It might help.
So I've seen with little kids who are kind of in a panic state and in their reptilian brain, making eye contact with them, regulating your own breath with them so that they can start to regulate their breath. And then you can ask them maybe how many fingers you're holding up. If they're, 2, 3, 4 years old, they can identify how many 2 fingers are. Or you ask the name of the color of something nearby so that they're starting to tune in to what's in the present moment and around them, and that will get the prefrontal cortex online. With someone who's older, maybe if they're willing to be touched, maybe you can sit them down, breathe with them, put your hands on the top of their head, which is a pretty safe place, and it helps to start to calm the nervous system. And then similarly, ask them questions that are connected to the in the moment sensory experience. Like, what are 3 things that you see in this moment around you, or what are 3 things that you hear, so that as their nervous system starts to calm down, they can start to make contact with the present moment and, again, get the prefrontal cortex online. Anything else you want to add to that?
No, I'm just thinking of a book recommendation actually that Dr. Dan Siegel goes into this, explains this really well, and he has really cool pictures. And even though it's geared and written towards the younger children, I find that it's super helpful even to remind us in the throes of how difficult it is to parent teenagers. And the book is The Whole Brain Child by Dr. Dan Siegel.
And that's a great one too. And actually, I talk with my hands a lot, and so the webinar is a little difficult because I'm trying to describe it with my words instead of my hands. But that's the image I have. He talks about the upstairs and the downstairs brain.
Yes.
And the downstairs brain is the reptilian brain, and the upstairs brain is the prefrontal cortex. And being able to access the downstairs brain first before you then connect with the upstairs brain. So it's a great book.
Yeah, and remembering to even do that yourself as the parent, access your own, ground yourself before, like Harmony said, with your child. Because when your child is anxious, all of your parental instincts get kicked up, and then you're running from the bear right along with your child. And it makes for kind of an uncomfortable situation. So make sure you're regulating your own brain as well.
So in that fight or flight response, one way to tell if they're there, if they're in their reptilian brain, is to either assess from the outside what they're experiencing in their body, or maybe they're speaking to some of this. Like, I feel really tense, I can't breathe, their heart's beating really fast. And this is a way to identify, okay, this is where my child or my teenager is at right now. And so you have a little bit more information about how to proceed. So if you see these things happening, you know that you need to kind of slow down the process and help them regulate their nervous system. And then this is also important as kind of a longer term process to help teach your child that when this happens, that this is they're not dying, but this is this is what happens when they go into panic or kind of a high anxiety response to something, and that they also need to learn to calm their own nervous system. So teaching them some tools to work with that, and we'll go over that in just a little while. So those symptoms include, and some of them are the shorter term ones, like increased muscle tension, faster breathing, faster heart rate, higher blood pressure, the skin temperature decreases. Sometimes you can feel them, or you'll see like a flush in their cheek. So there's digestion is inhibited. And then obviously you can't really see that tissue pair is inhibited or that the immune system is weakened. But over time, it's a good clue that they're experiencing kind of chronic stress or anxiety.
Yeah.
So it's a good source of information of how to proceed. Okay. So the pressure coming down on their head. So how to help your child identify triggers of stress and anxiety. So triggers are the things that send you into this state. And it's really important to start to understand what does make me feel anxious? What does make me feel stressed out? So we're going to start at a really basic level. This is one of my kind of favorite go-to acronyms. I use it for myself all the time with my almost 4-year-old. When I feel dysregulated, I halt, so stop, and assess if I'm hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And this acronym comes from the addiction recovery world as a way to identify triggers to use, but it's been found to also be applicable to general anxiety. because our stress reactions are so tied to our biological and emotional states. So if any of these are happening, if someone is hungry or sleep deprived, or having hungry, especially tied to low blood sugar, that's just such a huge trigger for anxiety. I know it is for me. But then the emotional side too, if there's something specific, something situational going on that's making someone feel angry, or that they're feeling disconnected. And this can be in lots of different ways. It can be that something's happening at school and they're feeling disconnected from their friends, or, this can also be, you can take this to kind of an existential level too, and feeling purposeless and disconnected from the world and a larger purpose, which maybe happens more in adolescence. Mm-hmm. But identifying these as a place to start, and don't proceed until you've taken care of kind of any of these different areas, especially the hunger and the tired. Mm-hmm. Anything that? Okay. Situational triggers. So again, pinpointing the trigger and then gauging the intensity for the anxiety of that trigger. So talking about that ball of stress or overwhelm again, and if you can break it down into smaller, more manageable bite sizes, it's easier to deal with. So maybe someone experiences stress from a lot of different situations, but they don't all carry the same weight of stress. And so breaking them down and helping your child understand for themselves and for you that maybe going into school is, on a scale of 1 to 10, is a 10, and tests are a 9, but homework feels stressful, but it's maybe a 5. So then they have an idea of where their big stressors are, and so you can kind of come up with coping skills that help address those individual situational triggers. So transitions are huge. Tests or presentations, relationships, from friendships to parents to siblings. I mean,
teachers.
Teachers. And that leads into the next one of talking to people in positions of authority, teachers, bosses, parents. We see a lot of avoidance around having to have what seem like pretty basic conversations with those people, and it feels totally overwhelming.
Too much.
Yeah. And then even facing changes in routine, even in the short term, like sleeping over at a friend's house, that may hold a lot of anxiety for a kiddo, and help kind of arming them with some coping skills so that because most kids want so badly to be able to spend the night at someone's house, and it really takes a toll on them when they feel anxious in doing so. Excuse me. Okay. Okay. Another one is that everything that you feel in your body, excuse me, I can get my voice back. Everything that you feel in your body is that we've been talking about can sometimes cause anxiety in and of itself. So the anticipation of feeling these kind of activated nervous system can cause someone to feel anxious.
Absolutely.
Maybe you can read through them, Jenny. For a second.
Yeah. I'll take over for a second here so Harmony can get her voice back. I hate when that happens. So our bodies tell us a lot about how we're feeling, and sometimes sort of feed off of each other. So the brain signals the body, and then the body in its reaction signals the brain. So there is some increased tension in your head your neck and shoulder area, sometimes in the chest. And what I often notice, this is a huge one with kids, but as well as in myself, even when I'm helping someone, is that we don't always breathe when we're in fight or flight. We don't always breathe past our sort of throat area. We breathe very shallow into our throat. So if you notice that in yourself, and I can even see it in the kids that I'm working with, where they sort of get tense and they don't breathe past their chest, then that might be an indicator of where their brain is. Disconnection from the body.
Yeah, thanks. So when someone is in an anxious state, oftentimes their thoughts are what dominate. It's almost like they've cut off at the head, and their head is the only thing that exists, and they don't have any sense of the rest of their body. Increased heart rate, sweating, unable to focus. So these are all things that if your child knows that this is what happens when they're stressed out, they can start to deal with it earlier on and start to regulate themselves or utilize some of the coping skills that we'll talk about before they go into a full-blown anxiety attack. So again, it's recognizing the trigger of that happens in the body that causes them to get even more anxious or more stressed out.
One thing that I would add to when you're trying to teach and help your child with this is maybe the way I would suggest, and I don't want to increase your anxiety in thinking about how to approach your child, but trying to be lighthearted in the way that you suggested. Offer a suggestion or an observation, especially when we're talking about our adolescents that are so good at being resistant, because I hear parents saying to me, well, if I say it, they won't listen or they'll do the opposite. So maybe even offering what I do in session is kind of from the side suggestion, where I'm not saying, hey, I'm noticing you're really tense. And that usually means you're anxious, because even saying that in a certain way may increase anxiety. Just, I think, neutralizing your voice, speaking slowly, and just saying, I'm wondering if you're feeling a little tense. I'm noticing a little bit of difference. Maybe having more of a curious tone might help.
Mm-hmm. Or even, why don't you come sit next to me and let's just take a few minutes and disconnect from what the stressor was, and just kind of talk about maybe something that's pretty neutral and lighthearted. Okay.
Okay, so then we can roll into some coping strategies. Let me go back there for a second. It's interesting that I rushed right past that. This is something that we all probably don't do enough of, even though we do live in Boulder. It's something that this girl is doing here, and it would be nice if our kiddos took time, but there's a saying that goes, if you don't have time to meditate for at least 15 minutes a day, then you probably need to sit for an hour. So just making that space for ourselves and modeling that for our kids will help them learn how to disconnect and breathe. And it might not actually look like this. It might actually just look like sitting still and not being on your phone for a few minutes before you log into your computer or eating or something. But I think that's such a great picture. You found that, didn't you?
I did. Yeah.
Harmony found that. Okay. So to start with coping strategies for your kids, one of the things that I recommend to parents is keep in mind that conversations, we often as parents are very direct, and as adults we just get right to the point and we want to discuss things head on. And while sometimes that's really important and appropriate, I want you to remember that when you're talking to kids about their anxieties, this is usually probably something that's been building for them for a while, even the younger kiddos. And so remember that it's a very back and forth fluid process, and it's not an event, but you will have several occasions to try to check in and build a connection with your child around what might be happening, because I find that it evolves over time, that they come to understand better what their issues are and what they are really feeling underneath. So when we're talking about fluid conversation, and again, I talk about the agendas, and I have to say I'm even guilty of this as a therapist because I want so badly to help them feel better, right? So I go in and I'm like, okay, let's hear it and let's fix it. And I have to remember just the really simple rule of active listening, which is repeat. And when a brain is in fight or flight, or even when they've calmed down a little bit and you're trying to reflect and teach so that they maybe can have a little bit better handle the next time they are in crisis, I recommend that you just repeat back to them, okay, so it sounds like what you're worried about is your teacher, or it sounds like you're mad at me because of your teacher, or whatever the situation is. And that way, what I usually find with kids after doing this several times is they'll come back at me and say, well, no, actually, it's not that. I think it's this. So just repeating what they say so they can hear it back to, back to them, they can hear it out loud, helps them to identify better. And then before you go into trying to fix it again, remember just to validate. I see this so often that parents want to help that they forget to just say, or even if they have trouble understanding, which happens a lot too, because your kids' worries are different than yours. So they forget to just say, wow, that must be really intense to feel that way. Or I can imagine worrying about your teacher or worrying about your grade or what so-and-so said to you yesterday in school is really hard for you. And then stop and let them add to that. Because I often find in communication, kids aren't great at talking or articulating, so we fill in the space for them as parents. We keep talking. We're trying to teach them. We're trying to get them to understand. We're trying to get them to talk to us. But then we don't leave a lot of room for that sometimes without realizing it.
I'd like to add to that that especially with the middle school kids, what they're worried about seems so disproportionate to what's actually happening.
Yeah.
And oftentimes parents are just like baffled by why they're so upset about it. But to remember that how they experience the level of stress that they experience around the little things, so to speak, in their life is the same as we experience the big things in our life. So money issues and job stress and relationship stress, how the level of anxiety we experience around that is the same that they're experiencing in their own little bodies around their own problems.
Yeah, their hair color. I hear that a lot with the girls that I work with. Their hair color and what the latest hair color is and what so-and-so said about it. Yeah, things like that. And I can go into later sort of how to keep them at a certain level of functioning, because I see on one side of the bell curve where parents almost take too much time to worry about every little thing with their child. And that can exacerbate and decrease functioning. And we want our kids to be healthy and grow towards being independent. And then on the other side where parents kind of brush over it and minimize. So, no one is perfect, and everyone does a great job of really trying to understand the kids better. And so I think just keeping those two extremes in mind. And the last would be reflect. And when you reflect, again, I can't stress enough to minimize. I tell parents, say 2 sentences and then stop and give them an opportunity to respond. And maybe they won't respond that day. Maybe they'll think about it for a couple of days. But just reflect to them. So it sounds like you might feel better if you tried this, and making a suggestion if the situation calls for that. And I know there are various situations. And make time to review. So I always tell parents to check back in about something. I think a lot of times we get into our own fight or flight mode. And so once things have calmed down, we're thankful for the peace and we don't necessarily come back to bring things up again. But usually our kids are thinking about things. I mean, sometimes not, right? Sometimes they're more resilient than us, but just make time to check back in. And if they seem agitated and they don't want to talk about it, then say, what might be a good time for you? And make a date, go get ice cream, go do something together where there's just that time to just be together. And just offer acceptance, even in your own mind, even no matter what you're saying to your child, but say, okay, this transition into 8th grade seems to be a difficult year. This is what's going to be happening for my child this year. And just try to foster a little bit of internal dialogue with yourself about accepting what's happening. So one of the things, and again, this tends to be tricky to try to how to navigate because you don't want to force this, but what we're trying to do is bridge the gap between, Harmony talked about the prefrontal cortex and the logical part of our brain and the reptilian part of our brain. So there are times that I hear often parents saying, I know that they're learning all of these great coping skills, but in the moment they have no desire to use them. Our goal over time is to connect those two parts of the brain where little by little, even when they're feeling super stressed, they're going to have different things that may feel better to them. I remind parents as well as kids all the time that there is no quick fix usually. So these things that we're suggesting come over time and are things that you are going to be planting seeds by making these suggestions. But I have kids create literally a toolbox or a self-soothing box. They often love music, as we know the kids love music, but they'll put a candy bar, they'll put a stress ball or a picture of their dog, soothing smells. One of my girls just absolutely loves a smell. We went into Whole Foods and she smelled all the smells and found one that works for her, and she gets to take that to school now. So maybe together with your child, you can create a rainy day box or something toolbox.
I just heard Taylor Swift "Shake It Off" in my head when you said that. Maybe that's
perfect. Yeah, even suggesting a playlist that's stress relieving, a playlist that, you know, what do you do when you're super stressed? What music makes you feel better? And suggest that they play these 5 songs. And what I also suggest too is going back to that picture where the girl was meditating. You know, there are times when your child isn't stressed and they're in a good mood, and maybe there's a smell that their brain can pair to, ooh, when I'm in a good mood, I go to the beach, or I think about the beach and I love the smell of coconut. So pairing that naturally relaxing smell for them so that they can then start to use it when they are stressed and try to, again, bridge the gap between those 2 parts of the brain.
Yeah.
Okay. So this may be something you keep in mind and just say, or it may actually, I've had parents write this down, or if you have a person that's helping you with your child, but you can help them create just a flow chart to get them, when you write something down, it actually goes to a different part of your brain and helps you solidify what you're learning and thinking about when it comes to anxiety. So that's why I at least recommend the parent maybe write it down, and hopefully together with their child, depending on how engaged the child is. But just write down, okay, I feel today angry. When I feel angry, I tend to yell. And then when I yell, I have choices. So let's say even if their underlying emotion is a fear for something, but we've identified that the way they show it is through anger, this lets them know what the emotion is. And it, like Harmony talked about, how that can be the indicator that something bigger is about to happen. And it writes it down for them. And then you can use this on the positive too. When I feel happy, I tend to be more patient with my friends. I tend to feel better around my mom and be nicer to my mom. What are my choices of how to interact when I'm happy? Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think there's maybe in a second I'll talk about a couple of questions too and maybe help tease that out a little bit more.
Perfect. Okay. So this is just an example of what I was just talking about, but I used anger a second ago because sometimes that's how fear can manifest. But worry, really, if they're worried, some of my kids that I work with start yelling or start, being agitated in their in how they behave. And then so one of the things I might try to ask is, it's kind of cliche as therapists that we when a child is upset, say, okay, now count to 10, and kids always kind of roll their eyes at us and say that doesn't work. And I want to just go back and remind you that none of this may work at first. It's just the commitment to something that is most likely to work, like petting a dog maybe works for them, whereas counting to 10 doesn't.
So this is a pretty quick exercise that I like to teach, and this actually helps with kids who are socially anxious when they walk into a new room or into a classroom and they feel that activation happening. It's a way to help connect them to the present moment and calm their nervous system. And so you can either just say these things to yourself or you can say it to someone else. So as you're sitting, you just take in 5 things that you can see around you and name them. And once you've done that, then you name 4 things that you can hear. And the hearing one's interesting because we often we tune into the kind of immediate noises, but then it requires you to kind of expand your hearing out farther and tune into even more subtle noises that helps buy a little bit more time and calm the nervous system even more. 3 things that you can feel. So actually feeling, using the tactile sense, and feeling the cold leather of the seat that you're sitting in, or if, I don't know, if there's a fuzzy pillow around you.
Sweater or hand
Sweater.
lotion or
Right, or even just rubbing your hands together. 2 things you can smell. And then 1 thing you can taste, and sometimes having a mint to pop in your mouth is a good way to kind of play with mindful tasting or mindful eating, where you don't rush through it, but just kind of savor the experience of it and notice something different about the taste of a mint that you didn't notice before. And all this helps slow the process down,
slow the brain down.
and can really help with social anxiety.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this is what I was going to say in terms of that flow chart is anxiety can be caused by feeling out of control. So where do you have control in situations helps to kind of bring things back to baseline. So some questions that you can ask are, what do you actually have control over in this moment? And you don't have control over everything. So starting to separate out what is mine, what can I actually do, and learning to take responsibility for that, but then also being able to identify what is not my responsibility. And I can't control how people feel or how they act or what they do, but I can control how I act and what I do. So it's a really important kind of logical thinking process to gain as they mature anyways. Another piece is around gratitude and what I am thankful for. And this is a great practice for families to do together. And, you know, it differs by age. When they're really young, sometimes it's like, it seems somewhat silly, their answers, but just trying to teach a practice of gratitude so that not all is bad. Not all is out of control, but there are things that are going well in my life and I feel really thankful for it. So another way you can say that is what's going right and where can I improve? So again, this is all kind of strengthening the prefrontal cortex.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So creating a healthy environment, to expand on those coping mechanisms, I think just expand it out into your whole environment, your world, your household. Routine, especially in times of transition, or if you notice that, you know, even if there isn't a transition that you can identify that's going on, if you feel your child is in a particularly anxious part of their life development, then make sure you are trying to be a little bit more, I don't want to introduce the idea of rigidity here, but just be more consistent, even if you're consistently inconsistent in some areas, but just make sure you talk with your children about, that was a little confusing, wasn't it?
Sounds like my life.
Right. I think that's why I mentioned it, because everyone is sort of like, well, I can be consistent about being inconsistent. But even naming that for your children, you know, I know things are a little chaotic now, and getting them to engage a little bit in how things could feel calmer without, I often hear from parents that reach out to me, and during the process of treatment, I feel like the child that has the anxiety and then the meltdowns is ruling our household. I hear that so often, especially this time of year, which I think it's really nice we're doing this talk right in February when the anxiety level tends to be pretty high. So try to get from your kids what would help them to feel safer without everybody in the household walking on eggshells and just trying to prevent or avoid an explosion. You know, engage them in the process, but also yourself set limits in, well, I really notice the big one's electronics. And we talked about the brain being hyper stimulated. So I've had several parents just say the electronics are going to go off at 8:30 or they're going to go off at 9 o'clock, which doesn't tend to go over really well at first, but after a while, when the kids are unplugged, they find that they feel better. So they're a little bit more open to it usually. And include fun time together, not where you're hoping to catch those moments where you can talk to them about everything that's going on, but just where you're hanging out and having fun. And a lot of, especially middle schoolers and high schoolers, will say, well, I don't want to do that, and I don't feel good, or I have too much schoolwork to do, or I have too much to worry about, that I don't want to spend time with you. But still sort of playfully kind of inviting, suggesting that they come with you to the movies, or they take time with their friends, or sign them up for a horseback riding lesson.
I was gonna say, go outside.
Go outside. Yes, that's a huge one. Yeah. Anything you want to add about routine? Cool. And then with creating a healthy environment and providing sort of some consistency and routine, and one more thing I want to add about routine, actually, I've heard this a lot lately, is that parents or kiddos are telling me that their parents are requesting they not be on their phones as much, but they feel like their parents are always on their phones, or they're always working, or they're always sort of distracted. So I'm actually trending. When I first started my career, I heard more of, they forced dinners on me, and now I'm hearing more of, I wish we sat down and had dinner together. We don't do that. We all fend for ourselves at mealtime. And I understand that can happen sometimes in our hectic lives, but maybe making just a little bit of space in your routine for that regular check-in availability, even if they don't want to talk or don't utilize the time well, eventually they might. And that's why you want to set up the boundaries for them, or the space.
And those dinners, and I think you were saying this, don't include devices, technology.
Which applies to everyone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Put it down. It can wait.
Yeah. I had one family that I was working with do made a fun sort of game out of it, of like, okay, each family member takes a turn picking a recipe one night a week, and then we all cook that recipe together. And of course, they had 4 kids in this family, and of course, some of them loved it and some of them hated it, and then hated me as the family therapist for suggesting it. But either way, eventually over time, they had a lot of stories to tell about recipes that went well and recipes that didn't. And it was something that they could rely on each week while they were getting through this tough time. So stress reduction, make that a part of cleansing your environment. So again, as parents, make sure you're taking time for yourselves and modeling that by exercising. Not saying I need space, I need to get away from this, but just like, hey, one thing I do when I'm feeling anxious is I go for a run. So I'll be right back. I'm going to do that, and I'll check in with you when I get back in case you need me. Harmony said, and I'm a huge fan of this, and this time of year it tends to be more challenging, but spend time outside. I mean, the research on just natural light and sunlight and fresh air, and how much better kids sleep, how much healthier they are, and how much less stressed they are, is really phenomenal. Take space when needed. Make sure, I hear so often from parents that are going through a tough time with their kids, how much they really need someone to talk to and vent to, but it's not in the budget, or their friends are busy. They feel like they're burdening their friends. I can't tell you how important this is to your kids for you to be able to take this space though, and encourage them to do that, and not get anxious if they need some time to themselves.
Yeah, it goes back to that. If you're regulated, it really helps your kid.
Yes. Yeah.
Get there too.
Yes.
So the modeling is super important.
They're little sponges. Yeah. Just like our animals are too. I tend to see that, kids are really connected to us. So they take on what we're feeling. Okay. Emotional cleansing. So I did talk about this. I didn't think it was in here, so I talked about the meals before. But one way that we can just sort of leave our day behind and have a reboot when we get home is to try sharing meals together, but also focusing a little bit more. I know it's hard when there's stress. We need that quick fix, which is totally fine, but just cooking together and trying to have a little bit more healthy options. Kids they want the instant gratification of feeling good and having their snacks that aren't so healthy, but that does add to the body, and it will increase stress and anxiety if there's a lot of sugar and, within reason. I think everything in moderation, and I don't want you to stress about the diet, but at the same time, just make sure you're offering healthy choices to your kids.
And I think I said this before too, but being aware of blood sugar drops, and maybe thinking of it in those terms is
totally.
For you, what do you need to do to regulate your own blood sugar, and then helping your kid do that? So maybe it's protein, but making sure that those options are there, because fluctuations in blood sugar can just add so much to an already stressful situation.
Totally. Or food allergies. That's a huge awareness in the autistic community, is that different foods can trigger different mood states. But again, I've had other parents that go too far with that, and where they're so strict, like, this child can absolutely not have any of this, any of that, any of that. And that creates more anxiety for the child, because then it doesn't teach them to self-soothe and self-regulate. So you have to kind of discuss that with your doctor and figure out what works best for your family. But again, minimizing the electronics. We all check out by watching TV or getting on our phones, but making sure you remember that blue light that our computers, TV, and phone gives off is actually pretty addicting to the brain and pretty stimulating. Our brain actually releases dopamine when we are on electronics. So it can just be counterproductive to reducing anxiety and clearing things out. And then also clearing out the clutter. I literally have gone into girls' rooms, I can't tell you how many times, because I tell them what they're feeling on the inside is represented on the outside. So not to be super militant about it, but maybe having a fun family day where everybody kind of purges if your house is feeling a little clustered, a little cluttered. Okay, humor. I can't tell you also how when we're worried about our kids, we get so serious. We all do it. But I make jokes with the kids all the time, like, wow, that was wow, that one was kind of a big, I don't know, I don't want to say, I'm not thinking of one right now particularly, but I just try to lighten the moment sometimes without minimizing it by inserting humor or a joke, or like, oh my gosh, you did that one well, didn't you? If they kind of really bombed a test, or not again in a demeaning way, but in a way that just lets them laugh at themselves and take life a little less seriously. Harmony talked about gratitude, just finding ways to appreciate. And as parents, I just can't recommend enough that you just keep having faith. I think we are programmed, our instincts, to worry about what this means. Well, I have a great mom, one of my little girls that I work with, and she's always so worried that the intensity of anxiety that she's seeing in her daughter is going to just mean that she won't have healthy relationships later on, or she won't be as successful and happy. And I so understand that. And I just want to remind you that we all went through some pretty difficult growing pains usually, and just trying to remember that it will get better, and that there is hope, and that these patterns that you're seeing, you're working on.
Yeah, and that through these years, in terms of the brain, the neural pathways are just developing at rapid speed. There's so much happening all the time in these kids' bodies, and it is a lot. It is a lot for them to process, and yeah, having faith and trusting that it's all going to come together, and that it's, again, this is a normal reaction to life situations. And
yeah. And if you feel that, and if you trust, I mean, that's the biggest thing I think that my teenagers say to me is like, wow, you get it. You see me, you know that it's going to be okay. So if you can create that environment in your household without minimizing, like, oh, don't worry about that, it's all going to be fine. But just like, this is a big deal now, but we're going to work through it, and you're going to feel better. Having that underlying faith. And maybe that even means a larger faith, depending on what your belief system is too. That spiritual connection Harmony talked about is important. Any final questions from our audience? We have a couple of minutes. I know it's a lot to take in. Feel free, Harmony and I are available to just check in with you. If you find that you have questions after the fact, I'm okay if you email me and just do a quick check-in, or I don't know how Harmony.
You can do that.
Yeah.
I'll be going on maternity leave soon, so it may end my availability.
Oh, here we go. A question. Okay. Exercise. Yes, sweating, exercise, this is a great question. Super important. I did stress that for the parents, but yes, having your children move as well. And again, engaging them in what feels good to them. Here we're so athletically minded here in Colorado. I just want to answer this question a little bit with caution, because I see parents that are just like, you absolutely need to get out and go swim twice a day, every day, and this is what I did and this is what helps me. So just be light about it. And as long as your child is getting out and engaging in some form of exercise a couple times a week, then that's a great way to approach it.
I would almost just kind of reframe it as moving your body,
Yes.
and what feels good to them in terms of moving their body, that it doesn't have to necessarily be a major workout or a major sweat, which is great. And a lot of kids get a lot out of that, but also just moving their body in and of itself is helpful.
Yeah. Great question, though. Thank you, because I'm a huge fan.
All right. Well, this has been great. Jenny, it's a pleasure to do it with you.
Yeah, always. You too.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. Have a great rest of your day.